As we continue to look at imperialism in the 19th century, we need to understand that Europe was not just interested or involved in controlling Africa, or even still in the Americas, and yes, they are to an extent still there. Europe would also be found in other places on the planet. Let's look at how Europe will involve itself in the Middle East and beyond. The long-standing power of stability, the Ottoman Empire, was in serious decline by the 1800s, had been for some time now. And recognizing their strategic location with production potential as a part of the discipline known as geopolitics. This geopolitics is a driving force for nations in Europe, trying to compete for the most productive land and location to forward their motives of growing power. The Crimean War in 1853 will pit the Russians from Europe versus the Ottomans. Obviously, at stake would be some primetime real estate, most notably that around the Black Sea, and thus this is known as the Crimean War. That would give Russia, of course, access to warm water ports and expand its control and power. Great Britain and France are going to rush to the Ottoman side, and you ask why? Simply it's a balance of power issue. Had Russia won and expanded its territorial gains at this time, it would have upset the balance of power in Europe. The war would show Ottoman weakness. Despite being on the winning side, the loss of lands and control of what they held was on, and of course it's not going to come to a crashing halt until after World War I. Competition between Europeans over other Muslim lands of Central Asia all the way to India became known as the Great Game. Great Britain and Russia would square off again, this time over Afghanistan. This is a recurring historical theme, as Russia would invade that land again in 1979. So some Muslim leaders would see the future and adapt or be overtaken by the modern world. A great example of this would be Egypt. Under the leadership of Muhammad Ali, they would facilitate many social reforms, updating and modernizing their nation. They would change production to cotton in order to be a part of the global economy. Even the building of the Suez Canal, which would bring increased European intervention with money, and unfortunately would lead Egypt into debt, which would leave them at the hands of first the French and then the British, and of course European control. Persia is another source of European interest during this time. Location is prime here. Also resources. Now, not until the early 20th century does oil really become an important resource for them, but they were a major tobacco producer prior to this, and thus economic imperialism and spheres of influence would be commonly used to hold Persia in European hands. This is going to lead to conflict and, of course, corruption. Moving on to India, the Brits in India were going to be, as they lose power in the Americas, they were making a strong presence in the control of South Asia. British East India Company is going to be a hub of British trade to and from China. Cash crops and money would be leaving India into those Chinese markets. This British East India Company is a very unique situation. I mean, these guys have their own army. This is like a big corporation today protecting its interests globally with its own armed forces. The pros to this British control in India would be, of course, infrastructure with railroads and telegraph, sanitation and public health all improving, literacy in schools increasing. The cons would be the fact that all the political economic power in India was being held by outside forces. Cash crops would drive food production down, and with a growing population, that's going to be problematic. Eventually, the British had a hands-off approach towards religion and culture, but racism and policy that had already begun to threaten the culture of India. So you begin to have this tremendous dissent between the European or British power holders and those people of India. Pockets of disgruntled and discontent Indians by the mid-1800s as Christian missionaries would be forcing that religion upon numbers of people. India's both Muslim and Hindu would make up a large percentage of the British East India Company Army. These would be known as sepoys. And an event in the 1850s would send the gossip spreading rumors that the new cartridges for the new rifles that they were using had been packed with either beef or pork grease, which would be a problem for both the Hindus with beef and the Muslims with pork. They would not accept the ammo, and of course, wrongly, those who refused were jailed. This led to revolts. The Sepoy Mutiny would be an uprising of rebellion amongst this population versus British control. The British government eventually sent help in, and this, of course, ended the conflict, as well as the fact that Hindu and Muslim really had a difficult time working together to overcome their outside power holders there. Distrust would be the result, and many began using a nationalistic attitude to create organizations like the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, which all would be important later as India strives even more diligently towards independence. As Europe is seen in Southeast Asia, it says different European nations focused attention on different parts of Southeast Asia. The Dutch in what is today Indonesia, the British on what today is the Malay Peninsula with the city of Singapore at its tip, and the French in what is known today as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, but at that time was called Indochina, as this location was between India and China. The economies of these areas would grow with cash crops, infrastructures would be installed, but all this is simply going to benefit the Europeans, and we see this as a recurring theme. The area became much of a melting pot for religious and ethnic groups. Despite all this, Siam, or Thailand as it's called today, would be preventing European control by going on a modernizing mission of its own with effective leadership. So we're seeing that those nations and communities that can effectively lead and modernize and reform can sometimes prevent the European intervention. The United States was not necessarily in the colonizing game, but of course growing in power through the 1800s. Many American industrialists wanted to expand U.S. power and access to these new markets. Answering the call to oust Spanish rule in the Caribbean Sea, namely in Cuba, the U.S. government was forced into a war with Spain, and this would give the United States the Philippines, Guam, and even Puerto Rico. So now the United States is in a global presence imperialistically. The United States is also going to protect American business interests in the Pacific by annexing Hawaii in 1898. Earlier, their monarch had been ousted, and the president of the Dole fruit company, had actually taken over as the president of the Republic of Hawaii for a short time. So the United States is even getting into this muscle flexing of global imperialism.